Hello, everyone. Tommy, World at War Comics. Thanks for joining me today. Today, I have an amazing podcast, really surrounded Conan and Frazetta. But before we get into that, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It really helps support the channel, as you know. All right, so I was at San Diego Comic Con. I was able to do a few things. I had a little surgery, so I wasn't able to do everything that I wanted to do over the 4.5 days that San Diego Comic Con went on. But one of the fun things that I was able to do is to sit through some panels. And one of the panels, my favorite panel that I was able to sit through, is Frazetta and Conan, a legendary combination, and really talks about the impact that Frank Frazetta's art had on Conan, and really took Conan from this awesome character created by Robert E. Howard and really exploded it into the hands of many. Without his art, I'm not sure Conan would be what it is today. And they talk a little bit about how important Frank Frazetta's art was to the Conan brand. Now, unfortunately, we lost Frank Frazetta in 2010, but it was only 3 years later when Holly, Frank's daughter, and Sarah, Holly's daughter, Frank's granddaughter, came together and created Frazetta Girls. Now, I encourage all of you to go to FrazettaGirls.com and check out all the things that Frazetta Girls is doing to keep Frank Frazetta and his legendary art alive. And one of those things, obviously, is comic books. There is all kinds of other things that they're doing to keep it alive through museums and everything else you would do with an artist like Frank Frazetta. But this particular panel, they really talk about the impact that Frazetta had on Conan and how today we're taking in that information through now with Titan Comics and Jib Zub writing and some amazing other artists that are really staying true to what Frazetta started with Conan so many years before. A good example is the Lancer books, where they took short stories of Robert E. Howard for Conan and just added Frank Frazetta's art on top. And this right here alone caused Conan the Barbarian to really become what it is today. These little Lancer books and other brands that did the same thing, taking Frank Frazetta's art and putting it on top, really put Conan's stories in the hands of most people. Before that, it wasn't as easy, and we could thank Frank Frazetta for doing that. And then today, obviously, we could thank Holly and Sarah for keeping Frazetta and Frank Frazetta's art alive. I was also had the pleasure of meeting Sarah in person. I have met her before. She has been on the podcast, and she's an amazing human being. But one of the things that I was really excited about is meeting her. And if you don't know, she's an artist in her own right, and she also writes comic books. And she wrote the Vampirella Dead Flowers, and I was very fortunate to get her to sign the issue 1 of that. So a lot happened during the day. I was super excited to meet the entire panel. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah and the rest of the team to talk about the impact of Frazetta on Conan. And I hope, as a Conan fan, you really enjoy. All right, everybody. We'll see you after it's done.
As we call it, the legendary combination of Frank Frazetta, Conan the Barbarian. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I am a writer and sayer of things about comics. I've spent this entire convention doing all kinds of pointy-headed panels about the future of the business and webtoons and comics in college. Screw that. This is me letting my inner 12-year-old enjoy the moment, because how many people in this room, first got the bug of loving this stuff from seeing work like Frank's, right? And that sense of seeing that electrifying work never leaves, and any opportunity to share that, talk about it in public, and especially with an esteemed panel of people. I mean, there is not 4 people you would rather talk about this topic with for the next hour than folks I've got here. Starting to my immediate left, Sarah Frazetta. Needless to say, granddaughter of the man, but also in her own right, the head of Frazetta Girls, who is leading the charge to keep Frank's work in the public eye, keep the brand alive, and keep the cool products and merchandise that we love, including some that will be announced exclusively in this panel, on the market for us. Thank you, Sarah. To her left, Eisner Award nominated and should have won, painter, multimedia artist, comics legend, also barbarian, Liam Sharp. We have head of Conan Properties, who is in charge of getting all of this stuff, again, out to the market in the coolest possible form, Fred Malberg. And last but certainly not least, the urban barbarian himself, Dan Panosian, who has been doing his own legendary run on Conan. Two very Frazetta-oriented artists and two very Conan-oriented and Frazetta-oriented people to talk about this with. I'm just going to give a quick rundown of, because we probably all know this stuff chapter and verse, but just to recap, Conan was the idea of this guy, Robert E. Howard, who was a great writer, kind of strange guy, who wrote for pulp magazines in the 20s and 30s, and this guy wrote everything. He wrote sports stories, and adventure stories, and action stories, and boxing, and pirates, and whatever they put in the pulps. Westerns, yeah, a lot. And whatever he wrote, his writing style was so tight and crackling, you couldn't help but turn the pages. Like, this guy could really light up the page the way few people could. And sometime in 1929, something like that, he came up with a character called Conan the Barbarian, very much in his concept of sort of in this mythical prehistoric age of manly men and dashing dames and all of that stuff, sword and sorcery, a genre that he practically invented. And he wrote this stuff for a magazine called Weird Tales, which carried a lot of these sort of horror, fantasy, adventure. You could say that it almost invented the genre, at least for American audiences, for this stuff. So Howard's stuff was being printed in these magazines, and every time a Conan story came out, these issues would fly off the racks. People loved this guy. But the thing is that the pulps were a little bit before comics, and they had nice images on the covers, they had illustrators who would do these spot illustrations, but the visual representation of the concept was never job one. It was about what was on the page there. So we read about Conan, and we would see these illustrated versions of Conan on the page, but it was the words that caught our imaginations and not necessarily the pictures. Once the pulps went away, and then the fans of Weird Tales tried to keep a lot of this stuff alive, and so they started publishing the work of Howard and H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith and some of the other guys that were popular in Weird Tales in these sort of limited edition books in the 1950s. So we have Gnome Press, that sort of yellow cover there. That's the cover for Conan the Barbarian. Nobody's going to read that book because of that cover. Sorry to say, whoever did that. You're buying that book because you remember Conan from Weird Tales, and it's like, here's a book of Conan. But along comes this guy.
Handsome devil.
And all of a sudden, you don't care what's inside the book, because if this guy did the cover, you're buying that book. And so it introduced an entire new audience in the 1960s to not only Conan, but to a whole bunch of other characters. We're going to be talking about Conan here. But Sarah, why don't you give us a little bit of a rundown about Frank?
Yeah, so I mean, I want to start more because you know the history about Frank. I've talked a lot about Frank. I want to just be very specific to Conan for this panel. So in the early 60s, my grandfather's career really started taking off. He worked for Al Cap with Little Abner all through the 50s, so he was a ghost artist. He wasn't really well known. And then his dear friend Roy Krenkel helped him get some jobs with Ace for Edgar Rice Burroughs reprints. He started getting a lot of movie posters. So in the industry, he was known, but he wasn't famous yet. It wasn't until he started working with Lancer and created the iconic image of Conan where his fame took off. Now, to get this job, he actually did some covers with Lancer before Conan. He did The Secret People and Phoenix Prime. So Larry Shaw was the editor of the time at Lancer, and he was like, who am I gonna get to make this book just fly off the shelves? And he saw these two covers, and he was like, Frank Frazetta. So he called my grandpa in the office, and he goes, I want to hire you. And the direction he gave him was James Bama, Doc Savage. He said, this is what I want you to kind of channel when you're thinking of Conan. So my grandpa was like, I can do this. He loved challenges. So he went home and did some rough works as he did. And he, of course, in typical Frazetta fashion, he waited till like the last day of the deadline and brought it to Larry Shaw. I think Larry Shaw was like having a little bit of like, he was about to have a stroke. He's like, where's the cover, Frank? Oh my God. They were just, the publishing at that time, it wasn't like thriving. So yeah, everything was on the line for these Conan paperbacks to fly off the shelves. So he comes in the office, and you want to go to the next slide. He brings in Conan the Adventurer, see him on the left there, and as my grandpa told it, they were popping champagne, they were celebrating. My dear friend Arnie Fenner said that probably wasn't true, but my grandpa was the best storyteller, so he would embellish stories a little bit to make them more interesting, just like his paintings. Now, the fun part of this is you'll notice that these paintings are slightly different. The one on the right is probably the one that you recognize the most. That's like the iconic pose and the girl. And the funny story about this is, so my grandpa was, as I mentioned before, he was really working with Roy Krenkel and all through the 50s, he was working with Al Williamson, Wally Wood, Nick Meglin, they were all working together. So he never really went off on his own entirely until this piece. And after it was already published, he invited Roy Krenkel over, and Roy Krenkel was like, oh, Frank, this is amazing. He's like, oh my God, it's iconic. He goes, but he doesn't have a neck. And Roy, because he was so close to my grandpa, took his knife out, took some turpentine, scraped Conan's head off, and said, paint a neck. And my grandpa, because he knew Roy was like, just the goat, like he knew anatomy, he studied it. My grandpa was more just winging it because he was he would rather be like playing sports or taking pictures or be with women. So he didn't dedicate too much time to becoming like a master of anatomy. So Roy recounted the story, and he said my grandpa actually repainted the neck and the head in 2 hours. He also told him to kind of repaint the girl as well. He was like, just make her a little more, how did Roy say it? Roy said, Frazetta yummy. So he did that, and it changed history, right? Like this changed the course of everything. So I do like to give Roy Krenkel his flowers because he was the most humble man and really never got recognition. And if we didn't have Roy Krenkel, I don't think we would have had the version of Frazetta we all know and love.
So, book sold pretty well.
Oh yeah, millions.
And what are we looking at here? This looks like Frank in his studio.
That's him with Conan the Usurper, and there's Roy Krenkel to the left. We love you, Roy.
So prior to coming to this material, was he familiar with Conan, or he kind of liked barbarians. He had done some of his own.
Yeah, he loved barbarians. He was not a reader, so again, Roy Krenkel is to thank for even giving him after the first cover. He said, "All right, Roy, you're now my technical advisor." So Roy became the technical advisor. He became credited in the paperbacks, and he was the one that came to my grandfather and said, "I think you should go with this story in the book and illustrate that." And then of course my grandpa would put the Frazetta effect and get the peak action and all of that greatness. But it was Roy who we can thank for even selecting the perfect scenes.
Very cool. So to the artists, Liam, when is the first time that you encountered Frazetta and Conan, and how hard did it hit you? And how did you recover
You
it?
see, he's one of those artists that the first time you see him, it hits home, right? So I was a kid, I was at a school in Home England, a place called Derby. And we didn't have much money at that time, but there was a sort of old 60s concrete complex that had a news agent, and I would have been about 8. And we used to regularly go to this news agent. And on the shelves one day was this one painting, and it just absolutely, one of the tiny little book amongst all the newspapers and all the magazines and everything, and I was just transfixed. Didn't ask my mum for it, we didn't have any money, but I just couldn't stop looking at it. And every day I went in, it was there for about a week until suddenly it wasn't, and I felt terribly bereft and wished that I bought it. But it was the first time I was telling you, a classic adventure it was. And you know, it just is seared into my mind. I didn't know the artist's name. I had no idea. I didn't know Conan at that time, but wanted to very much. And suddenly it was gone, and I was like, you know, it's a void then, it's a weird thing. But about 3 years later, I won a scholarship to an art scholarship to a school down boarding school. I was like Harry Potter really. It was northern working class kid amongst all the wealthy and great. But the school had a bookshop, and in it they had a fantastic artist, Frazetta, and it had the princess, the Egyptian princess on the cover. And even though I had no idea that I'd been looking at Frazetta before, as soon as I saw that, even at that age, it's like, that's that guy. That's the man. You know? I sort of ran to it and grabbed it. Sort of make sure no one else is having this. You know, it's mine. I'm taking it. Sort of phone home and said, I need £5 or whatever it was. I have to have this book. Can you save it? And that began, yeah, and that was obviously the beginning for what is still the biggest collection of books and artwork of any other artist that I have in my studio.
So how about you, Dan? What is your Conan origin story?
Oh,
Or your Frazetta origin story?
yeah, my father was an artist, and he was in this graphic album showcasing a lot of different artists in there. And there was a painting by Frazetta, and he loved it. And he was a real art critic, and he saw that one painting in that book, and so then he found those Valentine books. Was it Betty Valentine? Where like the same ones you were talking about, and I was about the same age, I was around 8 years old or so. And it's a little racy, we can say. But you know,
Maybe you think it was always that's the other thing. It's like, I'm feeling something, I don't know what it is.
Yeah. I just grew up a little bit. Yeah. But you know, he didn't mind. That was approved. And then later there was this record store, not record stores we got. But they had that big stand-up Molly Hatchet in the Dark Kingdom poster, and I would, just like you, I would go specifically every day just to stare at that thing. I actually bought my book. I don't think there's 2 people left, but it's in my studio. And now I just fell in love, just like, that's why we're here. I was just obsessed with that look, particularly the Conans. I mean, those are some of the most powerful images. Death dealer, and I'm looking at the shirt that here this gentleman's wearing. Like, it's timeless. The thing's so cool. Everything he did is so cool, still relevant. And what's also amazing is he influences so many artists today. It's crazy. So now I have everything that's my studios. I have a few originals, and I even have for Fire and Ice. He actually sculpted. Marquettes, so I have those, and it's like, it's an obsession. It's crazy. So I'm very happy. I'm very, very happy to be on this panel. It's kind of like, I wish my dad was still alive and being, you know.
Very, very cool. So Fred, what is your personal journey with Conan, and what role does seeing these early Frazettas and everything play in inspiring you to where we are right now?
Oh, that's a great question, because I came a little late to the party. I'm a kid of the 60s, but I grew up in Sweden, so in Scandinavia we didn't have in those days any fantasy literature translated apart from Lord of the Rings. That was the only fantasy book. So as a teenager, you could go, if you went to the big city, you went to Stockholm, and I was maybe 15, like 7 or so, you would go up there, you go to the stores that would import English literature, and they would import from the UK, from England, and the English covers were different. So there was no Lancer editions, no Ace editions, there were Sphere editions, and I think it was like Les Edwards maybe did some of those covers. So it took me a while, and I think my first encounter with Frank's artwork was probably through the record albums, actually, because Molly Hatchet came and then you had all these, that was kind of like, whoa, this is cool. And then I had the fortune to come to the US in 1979, 1980. I was 17, I was working for, I was kind of like an intern in the gaming, kiosks, and all these board game and tabletop game companies, and then that was just like a shock. All of a sudden I was exposed to comic book stores and game stores, and for me, at the time there was sort of the two taste of fantasy illustrations. You had the Boris on the one hand, right? And then you had Frank, and of course, like what you were saying, it's the motion, the animation, it's something in that artwork which is just art more than fantasy. It's just captivates you and draws you in. And I think when I returned to Sweden later that year in 1980, that was my fantasy image of not just Conan. I can't say that I was a big Conan fan. I'm probably like Frank. I wasn't the man that read all the stuff. I loved Lord of the Rings. I loved Elric. When I was a teenager, I read Elric, which is Warcock from the English. That's the literature we got. And then, you move on and Star Wars and the movies and Aliens, all these great movies. But I had the fortune to go into the creative industries early on, so I was young. I came back and I got into making games and making comic books and books. And the first book that I published was in 1984 in Swedish. So I translated the Robert E. Howard Conan's, and of course we had to put the Frank artwork on there because to me it was always it's art. It's art. My grandma was an artist, and it's just like there's no comparison. It's the best fantasy art out there.
I'm gonna put up his eyes for that Madman book.
I think actually the reason is probably Frank channeled some inner ferocity, because this is not something you just whip out. This is something that comes from deep down. Maybe therapy for him. I don't know.
Oh, definitely, it was therapy for him. Yeah, he would say a lot of the times, like once he first started with the paintings, especially the Conans, he was so excited to get started and just to conceptualize it and get the all the composition down. And then when he would start laying out the characters, he was like so excited. And then once he got to the details, which sometimes like this one, there's a ton of detail. That's just because it would bore him. And I heard actually Joe Jusko talking about his process yesterday, and he said the details are therapy to him. So it's so interesting to know like what's inside of people and how you can kind of like psychoanalyze them just from looking at their artwork.
So this association lasted over a fairly long period. There were 7 or 8 books in the series. We're going to see a couple of them.
From 66 to 72. This painting, this Conan the Warrior, is probably like the least recognized work of Conan that he did with the fans. But that was actually, besides Conan the Adventurer, that was my grandfather's favorite Conan that he did. And he talked about it all the time. Like, he just thought that this composition was more fine art to him. He always said, why am I not considered a fine artist? What does that mean? He's like, he take it very literally. He's like, this is fine art. so to him, this is like such a masterpiece. He did 4, I believe, in 67. This one was also 67. This was a lot of, again, guidance by Krenkel.
What's interesting about that one is that here's kind of the back of the character. You don't even see his face, and it's still just so powerful.
Yeah, who did that?
No,
Like, it's so ballsy to do. It's like, I'm doing it my way.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, really, truly incredible. And then if you want to go to the next one, there he is with the usurper. You can just see how proud he was on his face. Like when he, if you want to go back to that real quick, Rob. We just gotta like soak in Frazetta there for a moment because I mean he
It's like Clint Eastwood.
yeah, I mean
But what's funny with this photo actually, because I had the fortune to meet with Frank down, and Ellie took me to the museum, and just like the Rembrandts are like super small.
yeah.
This is not a big painting. It's actually the real one on the wall. It looks big here. It looks like half his body, but they're really small, and of course they were made for pigment.
Yeah.
So why, which I think adds to the genius of Frank, because it's just like little brush strokes. It's just small little things that add to that motion and that animation.
I think too, like with his start with comics, because he was so used to just drawing in such a small scale, and he also, I really do think he had like a fetish for small, because I mean his signature, it was, what are you doing here? So yeah, most of his paintings were around like 16 by 20 inches. I mean, some of them like 8 by 11. I mean, just really, really incredibly small. And the detail, when he wanted to do the detail, it's kind of like when he did hands and feet. A lot of times he just didn't want to paint them because he was bored by it. But when he got there and he did like a toenail, you're like, how the hell did you do that?
Crazy
Yeah.
reflective lighting, something else.
Yeah, he was a vessel. Like I mean, anytime he would try to explain his technique, he was like, I don't know how to teach anyone. I just do it. I just get it. I mean, a lot of the times, I mean, his process, right? Like everyone has their own process. He wouldn't just sit and draw and paint, and he was out living. And then when he had a deadline, or he had someone criticize him, or he just felt inspired, he would go and knock them out in like 2 or 3 days. Some he did do overnight, kind of part of the exaggeration. I'd say most took about a week. But yeah, he would just get all of that emotion and just put it onto the canvas. And I think, like I said, he had a lot on his shoulders with really proving himself at this time. And Larry Shaw was like really like adamant about, man, we got to make this really big, Frank. So when he was presented a challenge, he was like, challenge accepted. We're gonna blow the lid off of this. And he did.
So a question for the artist, I'll start with Dan. What, if anything, do you take personally from Frazetta's style? What have you learned about the way that you approach this kind of subject matter from what Frank did?
Well, I think with Frazetta, and this is what kind of separates him from a lot of painters and artists, is that when you look at it, you see, like you said, a lot of detail, but in reality, it's more about the emotion. The hair is just like, almost just like brush stroke in some senses. But he knew how to like focus the eye and to draw, just paint rather over his illustrating where to bring that focus. And that's something I'm sure we still have to think about and struggle with. But I just like there's a difference, like say between Boris and Frazetta. Like with Boris, everything has the same veneer. Everything has the same amount of technical polish. But with Frank's work, it was different. Like it was a little bit more raw. It just felt a little bit more now for me. And that's why I try to incorporate this in my work. So I work pretty fast.
Yeah.
So it's very helpful in that.
How about for you, Lam?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. The problem with someone as great as Frazetta is like, these stylists are idiosyncratic. It's like, well, I was asked once to do for his 80th, celebration of his 80th for Imagine Effects magazine. There was a tutorial on a fantasy piece, but I was like, I can't, if it was a Death Dealer piece. I think it might be up there somewhere. But I thought I was about to go and get all my Frazetta books out, and I thought, I can't do that. If I do that, it's going to start looking like Frank. Because I'm just going to start channeling him, And it's really hard if he's so iconic, If you think of Conan, I think Frank. And it's like the way every time I draw Conan, it starts looking like Frank, and I have to work backwards from that, kind of to find myself somewhere in that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, we have different interpretations of Conan these days.
Yeah.
We've got, like Barry Windsor-Smith put a very non-Frazetta spin on Conan. Like we have choices in terms of inspiration. I mean, you you, I think, draw from all the different wells, John, you said,
In my heart of it, in my crazy fantasy childhood, it was like, God, if you could just take Barry Smith, Buscema, and Frazetta, you could create a perfect cone that would cover all the bases. But you can't do all of those things. They all fulfill different.
Yeah, they all have different personalities. Yeah, each one of those artists.
Fred, do you have a particular image or a favorite among these that really nails down for you, like that's Conan?
Well, you got one of those pieces up there, Conan the Conqueror. I also have at my house, I have the Claymore statue of bronze of that one, which so you can sort of look at it in 3D, and the force of the Conan the Conqueror is as crazy as Conan was in that moment. It's like, you know, that furious energy of like, you know, where we're at. And that's exactly what horse dressing is all about. It's actually combat for horses, right? And it's extremely hard to sculpt a horse in 3D. That is difficult. And he nailed it on his painting, and I think Claymore reproduced it excellently on the statue. So I think this is one of my favorites, but they're all great. They're all terrible. I know, I love his focus. Frank, it's always like your eye is drawn to the center, and then he paints all these, it's like a chiaroscuro effect with all the coloring and the lighting. It's just like fantastic ghosts. It's the adventure that has all those spells and things in the background. And you just look at it, and it's inspiring. So it's hard to pick one favorite, but I'd probably pick this one, The Conqueror.
I actually have a story about this one. So I just learned this the other day. It's a friend of Kirk Hammett of Metallica's, and he told me that Kirk, he had a couple Frazettas in his collection, but Kirk Hammett was such a fan of Frazettas that before my grandfather passed away, and he knew he was getting up there in age, he went to my grandfather and he said, I want to buy Conan the Conqueror for $1 million. And prior to that, that year was 2009, prior to that, the highest painting that had sold was Escape on Venus for $280,000. So if it weren't for Kirk Hammett, the paintings wouldn't be selling for like $6-8 million now. And you know, my grandpa was a real frugal guy, grew up in the Great Depression, would not spend $7 on a Klondike bar, you know, like a few weeks before he passed away. I'm like, Grandpa, you know, get the Klondike bar. But so he didn't know how to spend his money, but he knew like what breaking records were. So for him, just the fact that $1 million for a painting, it gave him the confidence, the affirmation that he did what he came here to do. And then soon after that, like 2 months before he passed away, he sold Conan the Destroyer for $1.5 million. So he just kept breaking records, and he talked about it a lot to my partner Joe and I, and he was like, "Can you believe that? $1.5 million. I'm like, what are you gonna do with all of it, Grandpa?" And he just like, but it was just breaking that record. So this painting, Kirk Hammett, I mean, when I heard that, I was like, wow. Like
Metallica then?
Do I?
I'm sure you do.
Oh, yeah. My grandpa, he was such a classic guy and so focused, which I find so interesting. He didn't really let new art in.
Maybe listen to
Sinatra and
yeah.
Stravinsky.
Yeah.
and he loved classical music. I mean, and so even when you hear great music, like I'd bring music to his kids, like, you know, my grandma loved ELO, and they'd go, it's nothing like Sinatra. I'm like, yeah, but open your mind a little bit. But it was like his focus even with like films, like King Kong. We watched it, the 1933 King Kong. We watched it hundreds of times together. So he must have watched it thousands of times in his lifetime. I was born in '88, so I mean, Fantasia, Night of the Hunter, Robert Mitchum, I find myself watching it over and over again because you watch that too?
Oh, no, yeah, my dad was the same way. They were almost the same age.
Okay. So yeah, they just kind of get real like super focused, but I think it's more like a superpower because then it just kind of keeps you in like your trajectory of like your energy, not like, we have so much information now where it's like, it's almost like it's overload. So what he did was, I think, really special in the way that he could just stay frank, grounded.
One unfortunate.
Danzig were like falling over on all these.
Yeah.
I was going to say one unfortunate aspect of your grandfather's frugality is sometimes he wouldn't spring for a new canvas.
No.
So the reason that you sometimes see some variations between the printed version and the fine art version, for example,
This, yeah.
it's not, he wasn't doing another canvas, he was.
No. I really think it's because he was, I would ask him that question. I'm like, Grandpa, why didn't you just paint it? Because it's my art, don't tell me what to do. I'm like, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just asking a question, and he'd get very defensive about it. But, you know, he wanted it the way he wanted it. So he didn't want the one to exist and have that mulling in his head of like, it's not right. So with this one, this is one of the only revised 2 Conan paintings, and this is one, the Conan the Avenger. You know, I think I really personally like the first version, but I mean, this second version is definitely more iconic. Like for most instances when he would do a repaint, it was for the better. There are a few exceptions to that rule. Sorry, Grandpa, I can hear him going with you. No, they're not.
Well, it's too bad for the collectors with a couple $1 million burning a hole in their pocket, but there are 3 or 4 versions of this one out there in the market, I'm sure. But that's how it goes. Do we have any questions for our panelists here? I saw a hand go up over there.
Yeah, well, Sarah, talking about Frank's, love of that small size images, do you think also maybe that was a function of him being able to knock it out faster because it was small?
Definitely. Oh,
Yeah.
he would have like, his head would have been spinning if someone gave him a giant canvas. So what am I gonna do with this? I mean, he did do a couple personal works like the Maasai Warriors, that were larger scale. I think that was only at the request of my grandma, when he was trying to like maybe pick a little bit. But yeah, I think just it was, I think it mostly was because that's the scale he enjoyed.
Yeah,
Was
well,
what he did.
I remember the Egyptian king was fairly large scale.
Yeah.
That was one of the few you did on stretch canvas.
Yeah, that was a 17 by 22 inches.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one a little bit larger.
Other questions for the folks up here at the back, sir?
I have a question for Dan and Liam. Do you see changes from an art perspective? Just Sarah mentioned that he was sort of staying in a mode. Do you look at as an artist and see he's progressing or changing or developing something across his versions?
I mean, Dan sort of said it earlier. You can see that he's playing around all the time. There's bits that sometimes the paintings get very polished and finished, and there is a kind of a sheen to it. I like the more kind of the rougher ones where it gets to the edge and you can tell it's really just the underpainting, but he didn't need any more. I'm glad he got bored. Well, my biggest problem is I don't stop myself soon enough, and I keep.
Liam's work is
Like, I've got to learn. But that one with back one, with the 2. Oh no, back one more with. I actually always loved that first one on the left. I know it's like he's so hunched up, and it's like I think you can obviously tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think he's just strangling somebody, and there's not enough action in it.
It actually was, I think, because he emulated himself with Tarzan and the Castaways.
Right.
So I think he knew he was getting a little bit lazy there, and he was like, I need to change it. So, because he had a couple times where he would, I think it was a subconscious or just laziness, and he'd swipe himself again, many years later.
Obviously, you can't help.
Yeah.
I'm not used to it.
backgrounds again and again.
I'm like, where did I see this before? Oh, I did it. Oh, shit.
Helping myself.
Yeah.
But I just love that kind of bulky, his neck also, the straining in the first one, it's just so, like.
I was going to skip ahead because we have a couple of examples of both Liam and Dan's work. So this is one. These are a couple by Dan on the current title, maybe a promotional image she did there.
I think that's the latest issue. Look at that.
That was for a role-playing game, it was black.
That was huge, wasn't it?
It was big, yeah. So it was a wraparound cover, which is why it was sort of blank in the back. But yeah, it was for Black Colossus.
And some of some of your
These are, nobody's seen these yet. This is, I've seen this for the very first time. This is from the 12 pages for Savage Sword that I've written, done the first 6 pages of it. So, this is a con exclusive right here.
How long, Liam, have you been waiting to actually unleash on Conan?
How long have you been?
Right?
So that's I was 6 when I first saw that cover. I think that counts. So 50 years.
So Fred, as we move this into the present, how important are these iconic representations of Conan from 40, 50 years ago to the current value and identity of the Conan brand?
Well, great question, because of course we're talking about classic, big, iconic artists like Mishima, Barry Windsor-Smith, very informative, very influential artists for Conan, but times change, artists come, but I do think that what Liam has there, I can see some Barry Windsor-Smith, but it's also very Liam, right? So artists are influenced as they grow up by their fans. Look at that, for instance. That's not so much, I wouldn't say that's Frazetta or Kashima, or that's classic Kenosha, right? But I do think that for us, now that we control and Baroque signatures, we do all the creative, and then we work with Titan as a book publisher to do the marketing and the sales and the printing and all of that. We decided we have to go back to where the core of the character is, where our readers are, and they are very well, they're kind of based in the 70s and 80s classic era of Conan publishing. So it's not trying to reinvent it, because it's very classic, literature classic. It's very archetypical. So let's not stray too far away. And I think what we're seeing here, this obviously is modern art, but it is also very classic in its rendering. And that's what we wanted.
By the way, prior to this panel, a couple of weeks ago, I had occasion to exchange some notes with Roy Thomas, and I mentioned that I was doing this panel, and of course, Roy is famously the person who brought Conan to Marvel Comics, and he talked Stan Lee into acquiring the license and everything. And I asked Roy, to what extent was Marvel's approach to Conan, which came out in 1970, right in the center cut heartland of when these Frazetta covers were coming out, how much did that influence what Marvel wanted to do with the character? And he says, well, it didn't really have a lot to do with our approach to the stories, because he himself was a Robert E. Howard scholar. He had his own views on how he wanted it done. He didn't ask Barry Windsor-Smith or later Buscema to take a particular approach to it, whether Frazetta influenced or not. In fact, they ended up both taking very distinctive approaches to it. But one thing he did say is that he himself, his Conan fandom was born buying those first Conans off the rack. And he says, I purchased the first Conan off the shelf primarily because of the gorgeous cover, and that there was no way that anybody doing Conan in the 70s like that could avoid doing the work for, being influenced in some degree by Conan. And he said, I said, did you ever try to get Frank to do the covers? And he said that was a zero too far in terms of our budget.
Yeah.
He said we could afford Boris for a couple, and then he was too expensive too. So, but he said he would have loved to have done it, but it was just not economically feasible at the time. Do we have other questions for our panelists? Yes.
So with Edgar Rice Burroughs, yes, he was led again by Krenkel. I keep going back to Krenkel, same with Conan's. And he, in movie posters, I mean, it was, you know, the art directors are on you, and they're like, you have to get this character, you have to do this, and most of the roughs that he would give, they would deny and say, no, you're gonna do more of the style that we want. So because he loved his freedom so much, he really loved working for Jim Warren and doing the creepy and eerie covers, because he said, do whatever you want. You don't have to follow a story. So, you know, we got some of his most iconic pieces with Egyptian Queen, Sea Witch, Night Stalker. I mean, the list goes on, and that was just because he could just do whatever he felt. You know, he really loved working with the classics, with Dracula versus the Wolfman, because that's what he grew up on. So anything that he got to sprinkle like his inspiration and love, that's what he loved most. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir.
I bet you love doing the Kong piece.
Oh, the Kong, yes, that was his obsession.
That wasn't the question. The question is, I heard that he did that drawing of Ringo for Mad Magazine, and that kind of got interest in the movie industry when he did all those movie poster covers. How did Mad Magazine get him? I mean, you don't think of comedy. Well, actually, Frank Frazetta did comedy, but you don't. A lot of people, if you see all the pictures you just saw, you know, you don't think comedy, right?
Right.
So how did he get the Mad, which launched the movie?
That was actually his friend Nick Medlin. He said my grandpa was kind of struggling for work at the time. It was after he left Al Cap, and Al Cap was the head honcho of the industry at the time, and said, "You're not getting work, Frank. You know, leave me. Good luck." So, and he meant it. He had a lot of power. So, you know, it was getting by with a little help from your friends, and his friends were all looking out for him, and he got him that job. Nick said, let's do it. And I think like the consensus was it was beautiful and grotesque. So people were like, what is this? Ringo Starr. It really left an impression.
And it really speaks to the trajectory of his career. That when he started doing these Conan covers in 1966, he was doing some movie art, he was doing covers for eerie and creepy and stuff like that. When he stopped doing them in '74, he was doing almost exclusively really high-end commercial projects. The idea that Jim Warren could afford a Frank Frazetta cover in 1967 and Marvel Comics couldn't afford a Frank Frazetta cover in 1971 tells you about how his stock was rising.
Well, Warren was actually paying him really badly.
Yeah.
They had, I don't know what other arrangements they had, but something was happening. And but he did credit, really, like I said, working with Warren because of the freedom. So he would pass up. I mean, the movie posters. He made, I believe, on his first movie poster, it was like $4,000, which was like huge at the time. That was his whole year's salary. So, but because he didn't have the creative freedom, he was like, I don't really care about the money. But my grandma was like, you do. Or, yes, you do.
I'm sorry, we had another question in the middle, sir?
It's kind of adjacent, I guess, but can you tell us how the cover for Epic is illustrated happened?
I don't know exactly who got him that job, but that was his only, I believe it was Marvel, correct? Yeah, 7 Romans. Yeah, 7 Romans, yeah. It was 1779. Yeah, I'm not sure, I'm sure they probably just offered him a good payday, and that was one of the ones my grandma said, you're gonna take that.
Frank did the 7 Romans, just as a favor to Archie Goodwin.
There we go. Steve, thank you. I didn't know that.
Who was the editor-in-chief at Warren when he was doing all
Right,
of the
doing
other stuff.
all the best issues.
There we go.
Absolutely. Sarah, do you have time to tell us the story behind this particular?
There he is. There's a man of the arm. Yeah, so Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, he credited my grandfather in part to why he wanted to play Conan, and of course Robert E. Howard stories, and he was so inspired. He did say in a couple of interviews, I believe it was at a bodybuilding conference, where he said he was actually a little intimidated. So he really worked on his physique to get, you know, Frazetta ready. But we ended up getting in touch with him through his agent, I believe, and I said I'd love to send him, it's not the original, that's canvas. So I said I'd love to send him a canvas print, and he was like, that'd be wonderful. And then it was the cutest thing. He sent this in an email, a picture with like the writing on it, and I'm like, that's so cute. So yeah, this was like really awesome. And then actually I was able to meet him. He did a book with Tashin about his life and his career, and he invited my mom and I, and we went out there and shook his hand, and he was saying jokes about Conan, and he was just real, real down to earth. So it's a very cool moment.
Very cool. So we're coming to the
No.
end.
I always have to say that. I'm like, no, we didn't get it in the original.
So we're coming to the end of our time, but you guys have an announcement. I want to roll a video clip that you.
Yes, so we're doing an exclusive preview of our official collaboration with Conan Properties to bring. Yes, so we're so excited. We actually have the painted prototype. He's like just kind of got out of battle. He's very delicate, so we have him in a little, plastic casing. But we do have him here. I know we have to be very quick on the way out because there's another panel. But if you get time, you can come by and peek at him. And we're so excited. Thank you, Fred, for the most wonderful collaboration ever.
So as we're wrapping up, I'd like to go down the panel and just tell us about your latest project or where we can find you at the con. Dan, why don't you?
I'm in Artist Alley. It's GG19, and I'm there with Frank Thierry and Jim Zub, who writes the current Conan series. So we got a lot of Conan stuff over there, and Jim will certainly talk your ear off about Conan. But that's about it. I'm doing a lot of covers, and Fred and I are talking about doing also some Savage Sword we're ready to write behind.
And speaking of Jim, so tomorrow at 11 we have a Conan panel about the comics and Savage Sword. And there'll be some special news pieces that I'm not directed for. At 11.
Dave, what's the latest on your?
I'm not set up here, I'm kind of free range, which is good night. I have got the 12-page comic Savage Sword next year, we'll also put about 48-page I've written a script for that. But I keep thinking, I'm all right, script.
You just want more.
I just want to draw more.
Yeah.
So that would be a full 48-page black and white with a painted cover. Well, that's like the dream to have a full magazine issue of Savage Sword.
Are you going to paint the cover?
Oh god, I've got to pay now. I'm not doing small.
Oh, now you're
But folks, if
Everybody
you,
knows my originals, they're like absolutely fucking huge.
folks, if you have not seen or read Liam Starham's books, which is a self-published, not unwritten, but it's their own project, written, drawn. This is Liam Unleashed. This is
Actually, it's very Frazetta inspired. There's copies on the English stand. That's the one that was up for an eyes. Now they've got the whole trade paperback collection, slightly oversized, and it's like 192 pages, full colour, painted, but that's digitally painted. So it's got you'll spot the Frazetta in there. There's no avoiding it.
And one reason, by the way, that we're so happy to see both of you guys on the panel is that, like Frank, throughout his career, you look at his stuff and think, oh, he could just rest on his laurels. He could just do the same thing over and over again. And he kept evolving. And both of you guys, I follow you on social media, and I see your stuff, and it's like if all you did was, if all you did was the same stuff over and over again, that would be cool. But you don't push it and everything. Finally, Sarah, last word. We're being kicked off here. What's new on?
Well, just stay tuned to all things Frazetta Girls on social media. We have a lot rolling out this fall. And this is where I am right now, and that's it.
Rock on. Thank you, everybody. Have a great Saturday.
Well, everybody, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Sarah, thank you for allowing me to record and to be there front and center to watch you and your entire team put on an amazing hour-long Frazetta and what Frazetta means to Conan. Really appreciate that. Can't wait to have you back on the podcast. And to everybody else, I hope you enjoyed it too. Please make sure you hit that subscribe button. That way you don't miss any of our other interviews and any other panels that we were able to record while at San Diego Comic-Con and other cons. We would love to have you as part of the family. But until next time, thanks for joining, and I hope you have an amazing week. Thanks, everybody.